Thank you for being here on our very first virtual bio conference. We are here today to talk about what it's like to be writing the very first biography of your subject, or maybe the first modern biography, certainly in my case. I will, let me introduce who we have. You'll have to pardon me, Carol. I don't think I've ever actually pronounced your name aloud. May I ask you to say it for us?
Sklenicka.
Sklenicka. Carol, as many of you may know, is the biographer of Alice Adams, Portrait of a Writer, which came out, well, just 2 years ago. And of course, her biography of Raymond Carver, A Writer's Life. She's also a PhD in literature, so she has done all kinds of work besides this. Same with Dr. Justin Gifford, also a professor, but is probably best known for his biographies of Iceberg Slim and Eldridge Cleaver. And I have here with me, all the way from Block Island, where they have very little internet service, Abigail Santamaria, who is the author of Joy, Poet Seeker and the Woman Who Captivated C.S. Lewis, and is currently working on a biography entitled I Am Meg, The Life of Madeleine L'Engle. I myself am working on my second biography, which is also essentially a first biography. I will start, before I turn the questions over to the panel, by saying at first, when this was suggested to me, that I thought, isn't it all the same, whether you're doing a later biography or a first biography? But then I realized the minute I gave it any thought that no, in fact, I had very strong prejudices against writing biographies about people who already had been written about. I say that because many times it has been suggested to me that I should write about a president, maybe Washington, maybe Benjamin Franklin, and wouldn't there be more money in that? And undoubtedly there would be, but I think speaking for myself, maybe it's a temperament issue. There seems to be perhaps more power. I started really thinking about it and thinking maybe I just feel more power being the first, or maybe more freedom, or maybe I just didn't want to have to read a whole bunch of things that other people wrote and have to respond. So I'm more curious to hear what other people say, because all mine just became psychoanalytic, and what's the matter with me? I just can't repeat other people's work. So we're going to take the panel, I think, by doing it through sort of the book process, starting with proposing and researching and writing and marketing. But I thought we might start with just a general discussion about the kind of the pros and cons of writing a first biography. There are certainly people who prefer to be in the swim of things already, and there are people who prefer to cut through the ice first. So if I might ask Carol to sort of start off the discussion, because I know you had a lot of drama, but also a lot of success doing this.
I have to say, I never thought about writing a second or third biography of someone. Both of mine have been first biographies, which is, I guess, why we're all on this panel. But I was quite naive with my first one. There was no biography of Raymond Carver. I was a teacher. My students wanted to know more about Raymond Carver, and I just was sick of writing literary criticism. So I kind of stumbled into biography because it's quite a bit more fun, in my opinion. And I sort of wondered, but he'd only been dead at that point for about 12 years, I think. So I didn't wonder too hard why there was no biography. And I would suggest that anyone setting out to write a first biography should ask why there is no biography of this person already, or, look in Publishers Weekly or something, ask around in this organization and find out if someone else is doing it. In the case of Carver, though, I just started doing my interviews, and I gradually heard that there was no biography because there was a big rift between the first and second wives, first wife and widow. And again, naively, I just kept going, which for me was a great blessing, because that's how I got into the depth of the story. And I kept talking to everyone who would talk to me. And I kept hearing that the widow would not talk to me. She ultimately did not. But it made it very difficult to get a contract because publishers want to know if you have the cooperation of a family or of an estate. If you don't, you're going to have to convince them that you can write the book anyway, which you absolutely can, and I did. But those are things you have to look into. As far as temperament and why first biographies, I think Debbie's right on the mark there. I mean, it's if you're writing about a more modern subject, unless you want to have a debate with another biographer, it's going to be most interesting to do all that research driven by your own curiosity and whatever reason brought you to this subject in the first place. I know Abby's going to talk about how difficult it can be to get the archives together for a first biography, but you always have to go beyond whatever archives are first there. If you're going to write a second or third biography, you still have to look for information that the other biographer didn't have. It's not just a critical debate. With Alice Adams, I was also motivated by wanting to give her more prominence. After writing about Carver, I was interested in writing about a woman short story writer, and she was one of my favorites, and I thought quite neglected. I think she's kind of still neglected. I'm not sure we solved that problem, but you've got to have the passion and the curiosity driving the book, I think.
How long did you have to work on the widow and the other main stakeholders before you could convince your publisher that this was?
I don't know, because I worked a long time before I even was trying to get a publisher. A couple people discouraged me, and then my agent. Well, I got actually one. Oh, here's how it went. One of the people I was interviewing, a friend of Carver's, loved what I was doing, and introduced me to an agent. And once I had an agent, that changes everything. And the agent, within a month or two, ran into an editor who was really interested in Raymond Carver, had shaken his hand once and felt touched by him. And so he was willing to, get on the train with me and help solve this problem.
Which is to say, it helps if you have somebody who's a mythical figure that editors are already interested in.
Absolutely. And in the case of Carver, not to go on about him too much, but there was an oral biography. So in a way, it wasn't a totally first biography. And I saw a lot of gaps in that oral biography. So, in a way, I guess I did go into something that had been written about a bit.
Did it feel like a different game when you were doing Alice Adams because she's less iconic for a lot of people?
Yes. But there were so many other kinds of differences. I guess, as I've been thinking about this topic since we met the other day, I feel like every biography is so different from every other one that this is not even the primary distinction to be made. With Adams, the people I had to talk to because of some, a little generational difference and her success later in life, I was talking to people who were themselves quite prominent and often reluctant to talk to anybody about anything personal. Whereas especially the people most of the people in Raymond Carver's life were really kind of good old boys and good old girls who weren't afraid to talk to you about everything they remembered. So that was just one kind of difference I ran into. I did have cooperation from Alice's son, so that made things immensely easier in some ways. Yeah, all those differences.
So if I might turn to you for a second, Justin, to talk about, we're moving into the question of, all right, how do you sell, how do you pitch one of these books? How did you, you had a similar, not a similar, you had an iconic author, Iceberg Slim. Sorry, that's the one I know the best. Of course, the Eldridge Cleaver also, you clearly chose icons, but certainly for the first one, you must have had to do some convincing.
Sure. So I have two stories that I want to tell as kind of a way to illustrate what you need to put in your proposals, because the proposal is the make or break document that's going to get you a contract. The first thing I'd say that you absolutely need is some kind of research that no one has seen before. That can be in the form of an archival research or interviews with family members or some other kinds of documents that you find. But you can't just go in there with newspaper clippings that you got from the New York Times as a way of telling the story of this person's life. You have to find something new, something distinct. And the second thing you need is a hook. You need to convince this editor that this person, this figure, has some sort of impact on contemporary culture in some direct and significant way. So I'll just quickly tell you two brief stories about my first two books to kind of illustrate this point. So the first book I wrote was called Street Poison, the story of Iceberg Slim. And this was actually based on my dissertation that I wrote for my PhD back in 2006. And my research for this project was, one of the first pieces of research that I did was I tracked down every single novel that Iceberg Slim had himself influenced. And he had influenced a vast number of what are called street lit novels. These are not novels that are sold in bookstores, but they're sold rather in liquor stores and bowling alleys and barber shops and places like this in inner city neighborhoods across the country.
Is that still true?
What's that?
Is that still something we could find if we, or was that sort of a
They're mostly out of print now. You can find them in a couple key bookstores, black bookstores in places in Harlem and in Philadelphia. But for the most part, these things are now out of print. So they start in the 60s and they run really up until the like early 2000s. But then with kind of like digital, the digital world, like these books kind of fall out of favor. But Iceberg Slim is really the kind of like pioneer of this genre. So I started looking for these books on what is at the time in 2002, a brand new website called eBay. And on eBay, I start finding all of these books and I'm reading literally hundreds of these novels. And one day I stumble across Iceberg Slim's clothing and shoes. His widow is selling all of his suits and all of his snakeskin shoes on eBay to raise money for charity because he had died a couple years earlier.
So wait, sorry to interrupt, but when you began your dissertation, was he still alive?
No, he had died in 92. So I bought all these clothes and I contacted Diane Beck, who is Iceberg Slim's wife, and I said, can I come out to Los Angeles to interview you? I'm writing this dissertation and I'd be really interested to talk to you. So she lets me come out there. A couple years later, I get a call from Ice-T, the rapper. And it turns out he's making a movie about Iceberg Slim and he had just interviewed Diane Beck for the film. And he calls me up and says, well, we need a literary expert in the film. Would you want to be in the movie? And I say, of course I want to be in the movie, but only on the condition that you'll give me access to all of the interviews that you do for the film. So I get interviews not only to the family members and all of the publishers, but then also people like Chris Rock and Ice-T and Ice Cube and Dave Chappelle, all the way down the list. And what I realized is that Iceberg Slim is not only this towering literary figure, but he's this underground cultural figure as well, who's influenced all of modern Black popular culture. And so this is my hook, like to go back to my original statement here of how you write a proposal, is that you have to go and get those interviews and go to those archives, but then you also have to show the editor that this thing matters right now. And if you can't show them that, you're not going to be able to sell this book.
Did you get any pushback for not yourself being African American, not being at one with the culture originally?
You mean from Jerry Howard?
Yes, from my editor too, or any when you were shopping it around.
Not really, because I'm a PhD in English literature whose specialty is African American literature, and so I'm not claiming to occupy the subject position of a Black person. I'm simply claiming that I can do the cultural history and biographical work that is necessary to tell this specific story. So, I mean, when I do get that question, and I do get it, I mean, my response is like, hey, this is my training. This is the work that I have been doing for the last 2 decades. And more than any other person on this planet, I know the works of Iceberg Slim because I've been reading and studying the works of Iceberg Slim more than anyone else. With a couple of exceptions, actually. I've met some guys who came out of prison who told me that all they read while they were in prison is Iceberg Slim because he's incredibly popular within prisons, and some of the guys there, that's all they read. And so, and I work in a prison right now in my spare time as a volunteer. And so while I'm working there, what's clear is that there's this alternative literary canon that is like a shadow canon to, say, Toni Morrison and James Baldwin and Ralph Ellison. And this is the world that I'm trying to kind of like uncover in this biography. I'll just quickly also say, just briefly, for my second book, I didn't have connections to the family until much later. What I did have, though, was this massive archive at Berkeley, the Bancroft. Eldridge Cleaver has something like 40 cartons. I mean, these massive cartons of materials, everything from his FBI records to his unpublished novels to letters to his mother. All of that is stored there. And so I spent 2 full summers, 8 hours a day for 10 weeks going through every single piece of paper in that archive. And then after I was done, I wrote the proposal because that was material that no one had ever gone through in its entirety. And it was only after going through all that material, I was able to write a proposal that provided an angle on Cleaver that no one had before. So 2 very different approaches to the proposal. One archive, the other kind of like family connections, and both I think can work. But it's about providing something new.
Was it easier to pitch Eldridge Cleaver because he had a more elevated standing in political culture?
It was much easier to pitch the Iceberg Slim because of that gangster rap angle. You know, once you tell people that Ice-T and Ice Cube both took their names from Iceberg Slim, and that all of modern rap is based out of this kind of literary renaissance that happened in inner city communities that no one is talking about. That's the moment where people realize, I got to hear this story. I need to know something about this figure.
Abby, I know different kind of character, but I know you have had your own archival stories like this.
With both my subjects, my first subject was Joy Davidman, who was a communist poet and film critic in the 30s and 40s, and best known for marrying C.S. Lewis, and the movie Shadowlands with Deborah Winger played Joy, and she's now best known, for that part of her life. But it was really, she had been similar to Carol's experience. Both my subjects had sort of been written about before. So she had been written about in many biographies of C.S. Lewis. And then there were a couple of small books that, like 140 page, thin books about her relationship with C.S. Lewis, but none a full biography of her. And then with Madeline L'Engle, my current subject in progress, there was a book published by FSG in, I think, 2012, of interviews with people in her life, family, friends, colleagues, editors, and proteges, mentees. And it is, I think on the spine, it says biography. And it's essentially, a compendium of oral histories. So, so there's some precedent out there, but there's no full, kind of more traditional biography, or there was none of either one of them. And I had really similar points to make as Justin, that what you really need in the proposal stage to show an editor is, one, access to something that nobody has before. So family, documents, interviews, people, and then the other thing is what makes this subject interesting, what makes the life interesting. So when my editor for my first book, Joy, that was with Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and she moved to FSG, and FSG was Madeleine L'Engle's publisher for decades, and they published Wrinkle in Time, and then had a relationship with her for the rest of her life, which was another 44 years, and published many of her other books in numerous genres. So when my editor moved to FSG and made her rounds of calls to editor and agent colleagues to tell them about the move, she called my agent and she said, I would really like to do Madeleine L'Engle with Abby.
Oh,
and
isn't that nice?
Which was amazing. I mean, the idea had come up like several years before in passing in conversation about possible next subjects. But I mean, how great is, like, it was such a great feeling to have somebody say that. But I was also in a place in my life where I was, having a second baby. I was pregnant with my second child. And I just thought, I don't think I can do both at the same time. I don't think I can write another book right now. But I couldn't shake the idea. So I just thought, there's no full biography of her out there. Let me just reach out to the estate and see if it's even a viable idea, because maybe somebody's already working on it, or maybe the estate doesnn't want one, and they're putting up roadblocks, in which case I'm out. I'm just not dealing with that. And
you mean like Carol's point, which is, if there's not a biography, why is there not a biography?
Exactly. There had to be a reason. So so I'm thinking about Madeleine constantly as I was pushing my then 2-year-old back and forth to daycare in his stroller on West 107th Street on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I finally reached out I did some Google searching and found that the granddaughter is the executor of the estate, reached out to her. It turned out she lived in the neighborhood. So she suggested we meet for coffee at a local cafe, which we did. And I knew that there was one collection of papers of Madeleine's. I thought that was it, because there was about 100 boxes there, and in Illinois at Wheaton College. And so I met with her and I asked, it was it's always a very interesting first conversation, because you don't know what you're walking into. You don't know if they're hostile to this idea, or if they're trying to feel you out, or what the kind of sensitivities are, So I asked her about those papers at Wheaton, and she said, that's only a small fraction of what there is. And so I said, oh, really? And
you said like innocent.
Tell me more. And it turned out the bigger chunk of the archive was in a Manhattan mini storage unit in a building on West 107th Street, half a block, 2 doors down from my son's daycare. I had been walking past it every day, not knowing that it was, not knowing that it was right there. I mean, that there were like original, drafts of A Wrinkle in Time in this old, brick building that I was walking past, full of storage units. So I left that meeting and I immediately called my agent and I said, I think I have to figure out how to make this work. And she said, yeah, you do. And so I was, and so then I talked to my editor of my first book about Madeline. And she said, okay, so I'm really interested. Obviously, she had mentioned it, but she said, she wrote a great book. I mean, she wrote many books, but she wrote a great book that she's known for A Wrinkle in Time, but did she have an interesting life? So that her question was her life interesting? Like, or do people want to read about her life outside of the one great book that she wrote 60 books. She wrote about 60 books, depending on how you define, introductions and anthologies and things like that. But that was the question I had to answer, and I had to answer it very quickly. So I did not have Carol's experience of having worked on my subject for a very long time before writing the proposal. I immediately dove into this storage unit. I was 4 months pregnant. I had a deadline that was immovable because I was going to be giving birth. And I wrote, I was working on that proposal. I was just like a sponge, gathering as much information as I possibly could to just write a proposal. I was very focused because I was like, I'm not doing this book if I don't have a contract up at the beginning. I'm not going to spend 2 years researching. I had spent 4 years researching my first subject before I got a contract. In both cases, incidentally, and this it can't be underestimated how much it helped that when I started working on my first subject, Joy David-Min, and as I was getting close to the proposal stage, I learned that The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was being made into a major motion picture by Disney and Walden Media. And then actually the same thing happened with Wrinkle in Time as I was working on that proposal. And
so that had to help.
It helped. I mean, it had to help. And so, but as I was working on the proposal and well into it, and the movie was getting, I had the baby. I continued working on my proposal, like in the hospital. I had my laptop in the hospital with me. And then, the movie date was coming, and 2 other biographers reached out to the granddaughter, to the estate, just as I was finishing the proposal, but before it went out.
Wow.
And she told me, and she wanted me, at least
The granddaughter.
One was a man, and she really wanted a woman to do this book. And we had, I was right there, and it was very easy. We could meet all the time, and we met all,
so you, in a way, because this is going to be one of my questions. I have only dealt with dead people because I guess it's also part of my desire for control, that I am afraid of dealing with people who have only recently been dead. I like them well dead, long ago, no spouses or family members. But so what you're saying is some of it was just luck of timing?
I think some of it really was just luck of timing.
And you're charming. They obviously liked you.
Yeah.
They liked you.
But access. I mean, I don't have exclusive access, but we have a contract. I have a contract. I mean, the first biography of Joy, I didn't have a contract up front about permissions, and I just sort of lived in absolute terror that I might piss somebody off enough before the book was finished to have all permissions revoked and the rug pulled out from under me. Okay. And I, at the end of that experience, said, I just won't do that again. So
you signed something.
So we had lawyers. I had an attorney, and the estate had an attorney. We had a contract drawn up, and then FSG reviewed the contract also. And it was actually in my contract that I had an agreement granting me permissions to quote from anything that she wrote in the book. Did
you guys have the similar issues or worries, I would guess? It's very unclear to me, to be quite honest, the legal state about quoting. I know that there are many opinions about quoting from sources. How did you guys handle that? if I might ask, Carol and Justin?
I'm sorry, I looked at the chat. I shouldn't be doing that.
Oh, sorry. And I should be
There
looking
was
at
a
the chat.
question. Your question was?
Well, just the question of when you're dealing with more recent people who are not inured to the idea of their loved ones being written about, how did you handle that? Because as I say, that's my big fear is having a loved one who's still living revoke all my access, or even the ability to quote from published sources. How did you handle it?
This is where this whole question of fair use comes in, at least if you're talking about a writer. Fair use is something that biographers need to exploit a lot more than they do. Carl Rawlinson is an expert on this kind of thing and is probably on some panel that will tell you more about it. I'm sure he's written a book about it. But with Carver, because he was a short story writer and I did not have permission, I had to be really careful. I had to count the number of words in each quote. And if I quoted from her, I had to count the number of words in the letter so that I knew what proportion. But when I did all that work, I then had the backing of Scribner lawyers to make these fair use quotations. And
Did you get pushback?
Well, I did, but we ultimately ignored it because we knew we were within the law on what we were doing.
So you entirely did it through fair use?
I had with Alice Adams, no problem, because I did have the cooperation of the estate. I want to point out it wasn't an authorized biography, but I had cooperation. And alongside the right to write it the way I wanted to. But,
my contract with the Langell estate specifies that I have permission and that the one representative of the estate has the right to read one draft of the book and can provide feedback, but that I only am obligated to change any factual errors.
Just factual.
No matters of interpretation or observations or analysis.
Justin, did you have any issues?
Oh my dear Lord, did I have issues? Let me tell you, I had two very opposing experiences. With Iceberg Slim's family, I got blanket permission from the beginning, and there was absolutely no discussion. I just quoted freely, as much as I wanted, as often as I wanted, and I had the book that I wanted to write exactly the way I wanted to write it. There wasn't even that much editing done when I turned it in. With the other book, one of the things that happened that was really tragic was that my initial kind of meeting of the family was that I had written a section on Eldridge Cleaver's life where I had gone to a historical society and gathered information about Cleaver's great-great-grandfather, who was a slave, and then who had escaped from slavery during the Civil War. And I had written up the chapter about that and then sent it to Cleaver's son, Maceo, who was living in Saudi Arabia at the time. And then he agreed to meet with me in Morocco, where we spent a week doing interviews together. And then through him, I was able to meet his mother, Kathleen Cleaver. And so everything was going along fine. I worked with Kathleen for 2 years. But before we signed any paperwork, Maceo actually died, and the family went into deep mourning for his death. And I would just send them emails about getting permissions signed. And this went on for, I don't know, 8 months, maybe a year. And I was getting closer and closer to the deadlines. And, I'm frantically sending them letters and emails and just getting absolutely no response whatsoever. And finally, like in the 11th hour, they came through and signed a blanket permission to let me quote anything. But I was going to have to basically either claim fair use, which my publisher was not willing to do, because publishers are notoriously very conservative about this issue. They don't want to go to trial. They don't want to get sued. And so they either want you to get a fair use signature, or they want you to take out the quotes. At least in my case, which was Chicago Review Press.
I'm sorry, what's a fair use signature? What does that mean? Just the
Well, it's just a blanket permission that I can like quote anything from the archive.
Okay.
But without that, then you can only quote through like what's called fair use, right? And actually, the Leon Levy Center has a really useful statement on fair use on their website that you all might check out. It explains how, I think what Carol said is right earlier, that we need to exploit that a lot more than we do, because we tend to defer to publishers who are a bit more cautious about this. So in the end, it all worked out, but I will never do a contemporary subject again after this experience.
Really? It was that harrowing or that stressful.
I mean, I was kind of looking at a situation where I was going to have to go back through my entire book and take out every single quote.
I know. I mean, I know somebody who that happened to at the 11th hour, and
it famously happened with that biography of Salinger.
Yeah.
Right. I might draw attention to those of, if you're looking at the chat box, some Linda and some other people have posted some of the bio resources on using fair use. And there's a question for you, Carol. Someone was asking you, I'm sorry, there's so many. This multitasking between reading and listening, it's not easy. I think the question was, Carol, you didn't have to indemnify your publisher, if I'm right. Marcia, I believe, had that question.
I think I probably did. I'm sure they wouldn't have not had me. Yeah, no, I'm sure that's in the contract. But I don't know. I'm not a lawyer. I can't remember exactly what that means. I know we all had to work very closely on it, and that it would have been very terrifying if I had not had the editor I had, who was both very committed to the book and very knowledgeable, because he was a senior editor, Colin Harrison at Scribner.
Abby, you were going to add.
I have my experience is more similar to Justin's than Carol's. I've had permission for both my subjects to quote from their papers, but ancillary characters in the biography, not always. And so the first, first,
Oh no,
the first, my biography of Joy, she had a very rich correspondence with somebody who was not a featured important character in the book, but their letters back and forth to each other were very telling. And it was really important to me to be able to quote and to show the context, to be able to quote his letters to her, so that I could tell the richness and the depth and the nuances of their conversation. And he wasn't even important enough for me to be interviewing anybody who may have still been alive, but his papers were archived at the University of Wyoming or something, and the archivist just sent me copies of all there's maybe 10 letters of each of them or something, back and forth, and was all I had in this particular period of her life. It was like the only correspondence at all I had related to a very important moment in her life, and so I quoted a great deal from them, and then the lawyer for Houghton Mifflin Harcourt insisted that I either had to get permission or had to take out a lot of the quotes. And this was the letters were from 1939, and I don't know how long this person had been dead, but.
Well, there's a question here, I believe, from Beverly Gray, who is saying it's another fair use. This is the problem with doing contemporary, but first biographies, is you tread all over these questions that perhaps were for some other panel. But Beverly's question was, there are major archival holdings on my subject that are not restricted, no descendants or family members. What's to stop me from quoting at will? I mean, I'm very surprised that if that archive was giving you copies and they'd been dead since 1939, they felt that, was it the archive who said you cannot use that?
No, it was my publisher's lawyer. It was the legal review of my manuscript, where my publisher's lawyer insisted that I take out, so each letter, if a letter is a sentence long and you quote that one sentence in your book, you are reprinting the letter, because it's not just a percentage of the letter, it's the entire letter is one sentence.
Oh,
so you're reprinting a letter. So that was the argument. So so we got into the nitty gritty of, well, how many words is the entire letter and how many words of each letter am I quoting? And I just sort of I was also on deadlines and I was trying to do all of it, and was trying to figure this out and get permissions and do the photos, and had a newborn, and it was like, okay, fine, I'll just
take it out.
I'm just going to take it out. But so I got away with as many words as I could, but I cut a lot.
Well, I might go to another point from Melissa Homestead, who has a properly derisive point, which is this whole thing is ridiculous. If your subject is not a literary figure and doesn't have a designated executor, is there someone to ask? Or do you just proceed until apprehended or until your publisher gets nervous? Is that the answer?
I'm always baffled when I hear, I mean, I've heard Carl Rollison talk about his experiences many times, and it's so radically different from what I have experienced during the legal read for my book. So.
Debbie,
sorry.
Debbie, can I jump in?
Please.
No matter what, these collections, even if they're in an archive, they're still owned by an estate. Like, I just want to be clear about that. Like, in rare exceptions, they're not. But for the most part, if you go to the Octavia Butler collection, it's at the Huntington, but it's still owned by Octavia Butler's family.
Copyright is, yeah.
So you're still going to end up, and I had to do this with the Cleavers, like that Cleaver archive at the Bancroft at Berkeley. I still had to get permission to quote stuff from that archive, even though it wasn't housed with the family, it was housed at Berkeley. I still had to get a number of different kinds of permissions to quote published and unpublished material, both in and outside of Berkeley. So the person who asked that earlier question of like, what's to stop me from doing this? Like, the answer is that it's absolutely still owned by somebody.
Is that unless you're out of copyright? Is that correct, or does that not? I'm sorry. We've turned this into a copyright and fair use panel, but now I'm desperately curious: do those sorts of papers fall out of copyright the same as others do?
I'm not a lawyer. I have no idea.
All right, then. Well, maybe, and I see already time is, I was told, 45 minutes is a long time. I said, no, these are biographers. This will not be a long time. We will race through this discussion. So let me turn a little bit to the question of the writing stage. When you are, of course, setting the table yourself, you can put anything down on it. So it's a big question. It's a big, wide open challenge to decide what is on there. But on the other hand, so that's its own challenge. On the other hand, if you are writing a later biography, you are, of course, maybe feeling like you have to answer to other people's interpretations, whether you like it or not. Any thoughts about the writing process being somehow different? I think we're all mostly first biographers, so maybe the comparison isn't there, but any thoughts about how you choose to do your winnowing and shaping of the material in these cases? Well, I believe I had Carol, actually. She had a warning, I believe is what she said.
A warning? Did I? Oh. Well, I have my method, which probably should come with a warning. For me, I really have to put everything on the table first and then figure out what's there, I guess, and what order to serve it in and so forth, to continue with your metaphor. There's supposed to be this wonderful new program called Scrivener that allows you to put everything together. I haven't used it. Maybe I will in the future. But you have to find some way. For me, it's just a Word document that's a chronology or a timeline. But you have to have one document that has cross-references to everything you have, including those thousands of photographs that you're taking at the Harry Ransom Center or whatever archive, because now you can take photographs of documents in a lot of places. So you go there and you come home with 10,000 photographs and no idea what you've seen while you were there. And then I also make a ring binder of all the letters that are in order. But those still have to be cross-referenced to this other document. Otherwise, I can't have it all in one place. One thing I always have trouble with is remembering what's in articles, like with Alice Adams, because she was really popular during a few years of her lifetime. There were all these profiles, and I could never, I had them filed all over and hanging around my office, but I could never remember where things were. So I probably should have broken those down and put the pieces into my own document as well. But then you have to find the shape of the story and all this stuff, because if you are the first biographer, nobody has pre-sorted it for you. Mm-hmm. You got to find, the telling details, not just every detail. I'm going to stop because we're short on time.
That's been my biggest challenge, has been having access to a lot of material, but that's not processed. And I have so much appreciation now for processed archives, where you can just sort of go in and pinpoint things. And even then, it's not. It really depends on who's processed it and how detailed it is, and it's still a treasure hunt. But the storage unit of papers there was some loose order, but there was a lot that was not labeled or that was thrown into other boxes, and trying to figure out a method for all of that without the impulses to process the whole collection first, and you have to figure out some order. So and with my first subject, there were some materials in archives of hers, but the rest of it I found just by going to the people in her life, and they would pull out a box from the attic that had a stack of letters from her, or in one case, a box of her unpublished manuscripts, and random things like that then I had to put into an order. And I did the 3-ring binder too, with letters in chronological order.
Do you? I use the same method Carol does. I have a massive well, now it's about 8,000 page chronology for my, but you can cut and paste things. So I've been cutting and pasting large chunks of things in my first biography when there was less cutting and pasting. It was a shorter chronology. But I'm curious, Justin and Abby, do you do the same thing? I feel like I can't see the shape of the story unless it is literally contemporary. I'm seeing everything contemporaneously. There was a fire over here. His mother was sad over here, and here he is writing this book. But maybe other people have other ways of handling. I'm curious what you guys do. I'm pointing to you, Justin, as well.
I would say mine is a little bit more rhizomatic. I do have a document where I put a kind of scrolling linear narrative in the Word document for the whole manuscript. But then what I also do is create, when I go through an archive, what I do is 2 things. I read each page and I look for informational shit that is just biographical, this gets us from point A to point B. And I put that directly into the document and almost immediately. Mm-hmm. But then I'm also looking for gems, right? Illustrative examples that really help understand this moment. I'm not saying anything surprising here. I'm sure that all of you that write biographies or read biographies are familiar with this. But then I also put those into the document as well, alongside the kind of the biographical things. so that I'm constantly kind of making a reduction and like putting the ingredients in through the archive, and then from that kind of winnowing it down draft after draft. But my initial impulse is to both include biographical stuff and these like little vignettes that give kind of flavor or dimension to the subject of the biography.
Same. Wait, I have a question here. Sorry, Carol. Elizabeth Ranker is asking, Carol, do you create paper copies of your archival scans for your binder? The paper question, does it live digitally?
You know, that's kind of shifted over the years, but I do. Yeah, for my ring binder, I print the letters. It's not every single letter that she ever wrote that I have. So I am already doing a reduction, I guess, with the things I choose to print. But I still like some paper, yeah. But
go ahead, sorry.
You know, searchable is more important. Like if you type those sentences from those important letters into your chronology, then you can find them.
Oh yeah, that's the charm, especially as it gets longer and longer. Right. I wonder about the question of well, I see we're already moving towards the end of our time, and I have not. Well, there's I don't know if you guys are looking at the chat box. There's a wonderful set of conversations in here. Fewer questions than debate or discussion, which is terrific. I've done this now once or twice, and there's been sometimes nothing in the chat box. A sign of engaged audience. I'm wondering about the perennial problem that all biographers have, which is I want to put everything I found into the book because I love my subject and this is the need. And look, I mean, it turns out he really loves dry toast. And there's a moment where he eats dry toast at a significant moment, or he puts butter on it. Do you feel there's more pressure as a first biographer to be like, if I don't put it in there, no one will probably come back this way again, as opposed to wanting to really shape the later interpretations in a way that perhaps will maybe guide later interpreters?
As opposed to?
Well, maybe, well, yes, I do think having a strong interpretive lens, strong interpretive narrative is different than putting in everything that you found because it was really cool. I don't, maybe I'm being naive when I say that, but I know a lot of biographers have that problem, even when.
No, I think with the first biography, there is that issue with thinking it'll be lost if you don't put it in there, but that's what archives are for. You know, try to put your own stuff in an archive somewhere.
Yeah, that's right. Justin, you were going to say.
Narrow it down for the book.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think you have to decide what you believe before you write the biography. And I myself am a straight up hardcore leftist Marxist. And so I see the biography as an opportunity to think about how the individual reflects historical conditions. So I'm not interested in putting any details in there that don't help me illuminate what is going on in history. So when I'm talking about Iceberg Slim, I'm never just talking about Iceberg Slim. I'm also talking about Jim Crow. I'm talking about the civil rights movement. I'm talking about the Rodney King beatings. Those are the things that are important to me. And so every detail that I include about Iceberg Slim is in the service of telling that broader narrative.
I see that Rachel Greenfield has asked a question very similar to that. Have you already decided with what attitude you're approaching your subject before you start your chronology? And even they're saying even before you start your chronology and your quote typing. So you sound like, yes, you come to this with enough general knowledge that's where you're looking. You've chosen this subject, Justin, it sounds like, to be a lens on a time that you find interesting.
I mean, it's certainly as someone who studies African-American history, especially from the time of the Great Migration to now, I have a pretty clear sense of what has happened to Black people under the regimes of white supremacy and police violence. And because I have those pretty strongly held beliefs, that does inform the way that I think about someone like Iceberg Slim or any Black person who's serving under the criminal justice system. So, yeah, that is a kind of a model and a framework that I bring when I bring a framework to this topic.
Well, let me turn it to Abby, because it's a similar question Sarah Fitzgerald has here. Well, Sarah has a point above it, which is, I wish archives would enlist more retired baby boomer volunteers to create finding aids. An excellent idea. I wish somebody would hear that. Those baby boomers, they don't have enough to do. But Sarah's question is, to repeat an earlier question that got lost in the chat, to Abby, curious about Madeleine L'Engle's memoir about her marriage, two-part invention. Has that turned out to be accurate? So that slightly different thing, you may be not coming at from it, maybe you are coming at it from her place in history and how she illuminates 20th century literary culture or feminist culture or lots of things. But it also, you have quite she has written a great deal about herself, like all of these characters. Did you feel like you were in debate with her writing about herself? And most specifically, has that turned out to be accurate, her memoir?
Well, first I will say I do have a pair of retired baby boomer volunteers who are creating a finding aid of my, I think it's more than 30,000 digitized images that I have of L'Engle papers.
See, everyone needs some of those.
Yeah.
Everyone needs some of those.
And they're so excited about it, and they're a married couple, and they're amazing. They're actually very tech savvy, but well, her daughter, she wrote a series of memoirs called the Crosswicks books that are her daughter at least calls fiction.
Oh.
So I mean, there's a lot of truth in there, but there's a lot of fictionalization. And figuring out what's what is really challenging. It's not always clear cut.
Did question for all of you, because I feel this in the book I just finished, because I relied somewhat, maybe too much sometimes, on the memoir that my subject wrote, which is plainly not correct, whitewashed. And so I happened to have the ghostwriter's notes. So it was easy for me to see where it was whitewashed specifically, but it was also clear that it was whitewashed in a variety of different ways. But I had a real hesitation about wanting to argue with her, because I also wanted to rely on her statements about herself to some extent. So I didn't want to undermine her credibility right off the bat. Did you find yourself arguing with the interpretations of your own subjects, and how did you handle that? I'm curious.
Well, my book's still in progress, so I'm still figuring, and I'm really still in the research phase. So I haven't quite figured out how to handle that, because I have not only the Crosswicks journals, which were the published memoirs, but also I have about 60 years of her private diaries that she wrote in almost daily. Wow. And then she also gave many speeches and lectures in which she told and retold many of the same anecdotes, some of which are in her journals, some of which are in the published books. And there are many slightly different variations on the same anecdotes. So trying to figure that out and how do I, if I quote, when I address the fact that she wasn't always truthful, or she believed in the spirit of the truth, not the letter of the truth.
Yes.
So, and she said that often. And how do I then quote her journals with authority as evidence for anything if that evidence, if I'm also calling that evidence into question? So those are questions I'm working through right now.
Other thoughts about how you, Carol and Justin, how you handled that? I'm sure you must have had that problem.
Go ahead, Carol.
Sure. We haven't talked about Biographer's voice, but Justin just touched on it with having knowing what you think before you get too far into it. Yeah, you're writing the book. You've got views on these things, and there are ways to state them. I don't know if you want to necessarily argue. I'm thinking mainly of, at the moment, of Raymond Carver's essays about his children, which were incredibly self-defensive and self-deceiving. And I got to know both of his children, so I didn't have to argue with them. I just had other sources and other lights to throw on it. And that's just one of the things you're doing as a biographer. You're not an apologist for your subject. You're trying to tell the story with as much accuracy and breadth as you can. I mean, there were things, yeah, you don't believe each source, but the combination of them leads you to your own view.
Justin, did you want to, we're getting close to our time, but
Yeah,
let
just,
me.
just really quickly, I had a really interesting experience when I presented my book on Eldridge Cleaver at the Oakland Library, and a number of former Black Panthers came for me. Like, they came to the talk in order to argue with me about Eldridge Cleaver, because without getting into the like micro politics of the Black Panther Party, Eldridge Cleaver was ousted from that party in the early 70s, and the Black Panthers basically turned their backs on him. So they wanted to come and fight me about Eldridge Cleaver, and it was a really interesting experience where they were matching their kind of personal histories against my archival knowledge.
And this was after your book was published, is that correct?
This was a kind of a promotional talk.
Yeah.
At the library.
Mm-hmm.
And, it was friendly enough, but it was clear that, we had two different perspectives. They were there to tell their kind of personal stories and how they felt about Eldridge Cleaver. And I was there to say, look, I've unearthed all of this archival material, and this tells a certain story as well. And I'm also not gonna, naysay your point of view, but also it's important to know this information about Cleaver to get the whole picture. So that was an experience where, these are people that I respect more than anybody, the Black Panthers. And yet I found myself in this really interesting argument with them over the contents of that book.
I would have loved to have been there for that. I am very sorry to say that this time has raced by, and it is 5:30. If we were in a conference room somewhere, we would have to clear out. My understanding is we have an extra 15 minutes or whatever, if anyone would like to stick around. There are some questions. There's a lively debate going on now in the chat box about archives themselves and how to handle archives. So what I will do is let me say thank you to everyone, all the panelists, for being here. It's a delight, a genuine delight. This is not quite as much fun as actually being like at the Leon Levy Center and getting to really chat with people, but it's really been surprisingly fun. And let me say thank you to everyone who tuned in, because this is a fabulous audience with great responses. If anyone would like to stick around, I know there are a few more questions that probably did not get answered. If you have some, kick them in now. I will say Suzanne Carbonneau asked me, how did I answer my own question? How did I handle the fact that I had to argue with Polly? I think I did it more through sleight of hand, I feel like, in some ways, than just sheer conflict. I waited as much as possible so that people would be further in the book and already have their own opinion about Polly before I started really, well, I won't say I totally contradicted her. In some cases I did, but I tried to do it, I feel like, with a high sense of irony, which irony, it strikes me, as the core of a good biography, because it is always about the gap between how we see ourselves and how the world sees us, and how that if you do not have irony in a biography, you do not really have an interesting story. And so I tried to be bald-faced, but also light, with a light touch, with a slight twist of, well, isn't that how humans are? Of course, she didn't want to say she worked as a prostitute before she became a madam. That's using your cultural milieu to comment without having to say, I don't believe you, but all the other madams said the same thing, and all the other madams said, oh, no, she worked as a prostitute. That everyone is willing to say it about everyone else and not themselves. I don't have to say she's a liar. I can say, look at what her friend said, or look at the other people in her situation. So that would be how I did it. I see we have a lot of people signing off, but there are still people here. Anyone want to kick in a last question or two, or a last comment or two?
I wanted to recommend anybody who hasn't read Deirdre Baer's Parisian Lives memoir. It's so good, and she had a whole set of criteria that she discusses and gives some amazing anecdotes around about judging whether a fact is reliable and worthy of and able to be included. And she had to have a certain number of sources, and and the one time she made a mistake, turned in a published book, turned out that all the sources had learned it from one source who was wrong. But that's great. That whole book is great, and touches on other things we've discussed too.
A great, wonderful woman, the late Deirdre Baer. I guess on one last question, since we're now in just the casual phase, because I feel like if, as a biographer, half the time, more than half of the time, you never have a second source. If I have a letter that says I woke up feeling gloomy today, I don't know if I had talked to her mother, she'd be like, she didn't seem gloomy at all to me. Half the time you don't have any other source to say even whether the sun was shining. If they said the sun was shining, I normally, in my ideal world, I would always want to have multiple sources to cross-check, like Deirdre suggests. But if we do that, how do we have anything to write? I don't know. What do you guys think? I'm curious.
No, I agree.
Carol or Justin, what do you think?
Yeah, I guess on certain things, you really have to have another source, but otherwise you just report the way that you know it. That's what notes are for.
Justin, thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, the Iceberg Slim biography is like surprisingly thin when it comes to actual archival material. If you go back through that and read it, there's not actually a lot that comes from him. There's some prison records that I was able to find, and there's some letters from the wife, but a lot of what's in there is cultural history that I reconstructed from other sources. And so I feel like with a biography, sometimes you're trying to tell the story of this person, but that's not always possible through their direct materials. And then you have to use other materials to kind of triangulate that story. So I guess that's what I would say, is that sometimes you can find unexpected material. I'll just give you an example. So when I went to, Iceberg Slim spent some time in prison in Wisconsin. So I went to Wisconsin Historical Society to get his records. And while I was there, I found a handbook that all prisoners were given in 1939 that explained what their role in prison would look like, including their schedule and how many towels they got and all of these kinds of like rich details. They gave me a picture of what his life in prison looked like, even though it didn't come from him directly. And so just material like that can be a really great resource for helping fill out some of these gaps that might exist with the actual personal archive of the subject.
Well, and that's part of the fun, I think. Right?
Absolutely.
So I have two final questions. One from,
Debbie, I just want to jump in with a practical matter. We have one person who has raised her hand. And I want to reiterate that others who might want to speak up can use the hand raising icon in the reactions menu at the bottom of the page. So now we have two people who have raised their hand.
Okay, I don't know how.
Seeing them at the top of your screen.
You showed me how to see the hand raising it, and
I can sort of control that. And
why don't you read? Why don't you, Steve? Why don't you read the questions there?
No, I'm gonna ask Beverly Gray to who's the first hand raiser to just speak up.
And then I think maybe we might end with Elaine Showalter's question, which is, of course, just maybe a slightly different topic altogether. Not different.
If we want to spend a whole nother hour, yeah.
Yes. How about we go to Beverly and then we'll go to Elaine and then we'll wrap it up. Go ahead.
Thanks. By the way, for everyone, I found the hand raising thing underneath the list of participants. So it's in the
Okay. All right. I'm learning. Sorry.
Here's my question. I would like to write a biography of Rudy Gernrich, the fashion designer, whom I think of as very famous, but I've discovered that younger people are completely in the dark.
You can't trust young people.
True. What I've discovered, there's lots of archives, but there's a former employee and friend who's been theoretically writing a biography for 20, 30 years. Which he claims will come out next year, which is the centenary year, which is kind of a big deal. If that thing ever comes out, whatever it is, by a man whose writing abilities I have no knowledge of, would that make things harder for me or what?
I would say this is what I have been told by when I very first began my first biography. Because it had academics who were writing about it, but not biographies, that, especially when you're writing about more obscure people, maybe it doesn't help to have 2 biographies of George Washington come out in a year. But it does seem to me that if you're writing about someone who is less well known, the more that is written about them, the more they are in popular culture, the better off you are, because then they are a personage. They are already someone that is the nature of human attention, that we like to know that other people are already thinking about it, and more is better. But then I take that position mostly because what can you do? It's a position of both resignation and silver lining looking, but I don't know if other people have the.
I think it can make it harder to get a contract if there's another book in contract of somebody who's not a George Washington or Hillary Clinton or a major figure. But again, it partly can depend on your access. So if you have some big trove of papers, and that can make a difference.
I would say too, you have no idea if this person's actually going to publish this biography.
That's what I've been wondering. He's got to be in his 80s, and he's been apparently working on this for many, many, many years.
Well, the reason I'm thinking that is because there is no reason to believe that someone who's been working on a biography for 20 years is going to publish it next year. Past behavior is the only true indicator of future behavior.
Go ahead, Carol.
Beverly, have you tried to find out? There must be someone who knows this person.
I have communicated with him to the extent that he has said to me, "Go away, I'm working on my book." But who knows what that means? He's a cranky, unhappy guy, so who knows what that means?
I see that there's a request here from Barry Burke. Can you address Julia's question? Julia Mickenberg's question. Interested in the question of how you make the case for a person's significance. Some people are particularly revealing ciphers for cultural history and are once well known but are not remembered now. We talked about this a little bit. Does anyone want to add something? Do you feel like you need a contemporary hook? For example, as opposed to they were once the greatest at whatever they did when people cared about whatever it is they did.
Madeleine L'Engle, it was really not hard to make a case for her significance. When I started talking to people about the possibility that I was thinking about writing her biography, I can't tell you how many people, especially women, got immediately almost misty-eyed and emotional because A Wrinkle in Time was transformative in their adolescence, which is already such a fraught and defining time in everybody's life. But that has translated into, editors who read my proposal and had that, immediate response to Madeleine L'Engle's, and just the sound of her name. She is evocative because that book had such a huge impact. And I had a piece in the March issue of Vanity Fair about Madeleine, and Radhika Jones, the editor-in-chief, in her editor's letter talked about, in the front of the magazine, talked about Madeleine L'Engle's impact on her life, her reading life. And I think that makes her immediately relevant to people. So that was not hard for me.
It helps if you have a sentimental favorite, that's for
Yeah.
sure. I never do that. I have to rely on the cultural history. I have to tell somebody why somebody mattered, and as a historian, I've always felt. But of course, Raymond Carver, you must have felt a little different between Alice Adams and Raymond Carver, perhaps, Carol?
Well, they're both from the same time period. I found more resistance to Alice Adams. And, it turns out it is still more difficult to publish the life of a woman than the life of a man. I didn't know that was still statistically true, but I think it is. Yeah, I had to make the case for her importance as a member of a particular generation of women and the changes she lived through in the 20th century.
Well, and that let me then, our last question here, and as was pointed out by Steve, this could be another 2-hour question, but it is related. Has been pointed out, literary history, there was a little argument I noticed in the papers, somebody saying, well, Americans don't do literary history the same way the English do. And it was pointed out, well, not if you look at writing about women. There's quite a lot of biographies coming out currently about women writers. They just don't perhaps get the same attention, which leads to the question asked by Elaine Showalter, which is thoughts about the withdrawal of the Blake Bailey biography of Philip Roth, as someone who they were writing the first biography and clearly ran into the headwinds in a variety of ways. Any last thoughts on that humongous subject?
Are you serious?
Well, no, nothing.
He asked what we thought of Norton's decision. Norton is a corporation, they can do what they want. But there are much bigger issues surrounding all that.
Justin, were you going to pop in there?
No, I said no comment. I like the answers I've given today. I'm going to just leave it.
No need to get it. Well, I will say this, as somebody who loves the hunt, I think that is probably, I can say my temperament is maybe more controlling, but it's also that what I don't like, who cares about the writing? I mean, writing is important. You have to write it, but I love the hunt. And what kills me about the Blake Bailey biography being withdrawn is my understanding is that he had access to some things that perhaps will never be shown again. That was some of the talk. And if that is the case, that he saw documents that are intended to be destroyed or put away, and now we cannot see what he had to say about them, that bothers me immensely as a researcher. I guess that's my thought. I'm sure there are more profound thoughts than that, but I, as somebody who wants to see every scrap, it already was bothering me even before the biography was pulled. Abby, last thought? I'll give you last word.
I think that's
No,
it.
all right. Well, thank you. What a delight. Even just, it's very distracting to see all these fabulous discussions here. And I really need a fair use seminar, it's quite clear from the experts in the chat box. But thank you all for being here. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Justin. Thank you, Abby, and everyone else. And next year, we'll see you maybe in New York, and we can all have a drink together.
Mhm.